squiggly phone holder for taking videos. All right, so to begin, we're going to make a chromatic black. So who remembers like how you made that? Red, yellow, blue, absolutely. And do you remember what specific red, yellow, and blue you used out of that general set you had? Phthalo, yes. That word is amazing and so hard to spell. There's like a million THs in a row, and it makes no sense, but I love it. Cadmium red. Cadmium yellow, yeah. And we actually used ultramarine instead of phthalo last time, or you might have. Today I want to show you how to use the other three. So we have phthalo blue, Indian yellow, which you'll notice is almost an orange, and quinacridone magenta, which is kind of like a purple, right? It's almost like a violet. And so if you mix this and this together, you make the most beautiful purple. If you've ever tried to mix cadmium red with a blue to make purple, like a lot of us tried when we were in elementary school, you might have realized that it makes like a gray purple. And that's because your cadmium red is almost orange. So it has hints of orange in it. So that orange and the blue combine to make brown. So it neutralizes it. Okay, so I'm going to start with my three primaries, try to have equal parts of each. And just sort of notice how vivid these colors are. These three tones are my absolute favorite to use because they're beautifully transparent. So we're going to use this for our chromatic black today, although if you did this last time, maybe switch and try the other three primaries. But you should have at least brought these three, and if not, then I can lend you some. And so as you go, you may realize that you sort of need to tweak it. So this is pretty green, and I'm going to want it to be as neutral as possible, because when I go over with a transparent layer later on in my painting, you're going to notice that whatever color is underneath, whatever the hue of those neutrals is going to mix optically with your transparent layer and create a new color. So if I have a very green underpainting, a very green sort of monochromatic painting, and I'm trying to sort of make this a bright yellow, it's going to just sort of make it more of like a lime green. So it's up to you sort of how sort of like invented or accurate you want your colors to be today. You can totally just like experiment. This is our first painting, so you know, mistakes are going to happen and they're going to be beautiful and weird. Mistakes are like the best part about painting. You never know what's going to happen. Okay, so I have my chromatic black. And because this is so transparent, it's going to make a beautiful tone for an underpainting. Does anyone know what an underpainting is? Yeah, exactly. So it's really just sort of like, it's the painting that's underneath, where you're sort of mapping out tones, mapping out your drawing, and sort of planning it out for the rest of your process. So when I'm looking at this subject right here, I'm first going to start with contour lines. So I'm going to water down a bit of this paint, and this is really kind of like the only time that you want to water down your paint a lot. And that's because acrylic paint is made out of three things. It's made out of a binder, a vehicle, and pigment. So the pigment is whatever color is in your paint. The vehicle is water, and the binder, what do you think binds acrylic paint to your canvas?
Glue?
Really close. It's just plastic. So it's plastic that sort of will dry. That's why it really feels like a film of plastic later on. And gum arabic is what's in gouache and watercolor as the binder. So because I'm adding a lot of water to my paint here, it's actually breaking down the binder. So if I was just to only paint with really watered down acrylic, it eventually could, like the pigments could lift off the canvas over time. So so making an underpainting is a really great time to paint like this. But if you ever paint like this later on, you'll need to seal it afterwards. So I'm going to just start, and I'm just gonna be really loose, looking for sort of relationships, looking for contour lines. You can start out pretty light, get a lot of water on your brush so you can really sort of fix your drawing as you go. You know, this is not at all an apple yet, and that is totally fine. And you know, I just realized I have this beautiful shadow to the right, so I'm actually gonna sort of like, you know, wash it out and decide, nah, I'm good on that. I'm gonna slide it over instead. So an underpainting is really a time to map out the most general things that you're seeing, and we're not at all thinking about details yet. So I have this shadow sort of coming out here. I've got this lemon. I'm sort of trying to use this part of the process to decide where things are sitting in relation to one another. And if you're painting something really organic like I am, you have a little bit more freedom. If you're painting something that's really rigid, you might need to use some sort of sighting skills. So to look at an object and sort of measure the angle by closing one eye and holding a paintbrush up to it in order to translate that angle over onto your piece. So if you're working with like a cup, or there's some really dramatically shaped vessels in there that you might be painting, those you'll need to definitely check all of your angles. And I can still look and sort of check the general through line of this lemon and compare it to my lemon on here. But I'm also gonna just sort of like roughly put in a shadow or two. So while this is my lemon, I've got this sort of dramatic shadow coming out here. And that's why I really wanna be in a space in the room with some interesting light. Okay, and then if you're painting something super organic like a flower, you might sort of just almost like look at your subject more than your canvas. So I'm almost doing sort of like a blind contour where I'm looking, but I'm also kind of guessing, putting down the exact curve that I see in the moment. It might be wrong, and that's totally fine, and I'll have an opportunity to fix it later. So because this is like so very impermanent, this is the chance to really sort of figure out where things need to be, and you don't need to stress about it being perfect at all. Okay. So, and then I always think it's important to sort of find a sort of horizon line. So if I imagine what most of your painting will be on this sort of shelf, and there will be sort of a difference in space between this part of what I'm seeing and what's behind it. So I recommend going in and sort of just mapping out exactly how that horizon line relates to the apple, relates to the flower behind it, and I'm just gonna sort of map it in. And as you sort of figure out your drawing a little bit more, you may want to sort of use thicker paint to really sort of have a more emphasized line, because you might have lots of lines in this process. Okay. Does anyone have any questions thus far?
Do you want us to paint on the blocks, on the boards?
Yes, so I brought boards for you in case, and these will be a fun thing because they're free. So if it's like a disaster of a painting, which is never a disaster because it's always a learning experience, it's not a big deal because it's free. So basically you're really just gonna sort of map out the most important things and always look back at your subject to check how things are going. And then later on, you're gonna start to build up space. So once I sort of figure out my underpainting, you'll see sort of like how it's going. And there's aspects of this that are probably wrong. So before I go in and really put in thick paint, I'm gonna take another good look at my subject. And so the next thing I'm gonna do is what you did in the sketchbook assignment, where you sort of mixed up a value and placed it where you saw it. So let's see, where was I going with that? So basically, with acrylic paint, because it's not oils and it will dry really fast on your palette, I recommend keeping your paint in some pretty thick blobs, like this, and then sort of throw some water at it every now and then, because it's so humid, or it's so dry and hot here. So you want to throw some water at it every now and then, because water is always evaporating from it. And I like to mix up one tone at a time, because if I was painting with oils, I maybe could go ahead and mix up all of the tones I needed at once and have them all ready. But with acrylics, if I did that, they would all be dry before I even get to them. So I'm first gonna maybe think about this background. So generally, there's thousands of ways to make a painting, but I like to sort of first sort of show everyone the sort of Bob Ross method of starting with the thing that's furthest back and then sort of slowly working your way closer up to the viewer. So this is gonna be a really helpful technique in sort of solidifying your figure-ground relationships. So one thing looking like it's physically on top of something else is gonna be easier because that's how your paint is sitting. Because you're literally putting something on top of the other thing. So when you're ready to sort of mix up a thicker color, you're really sort of looking at the relative value between everything. So what I like to do is sort of imagine, and sometimes you want to use like a viewfinder to sort of figure out your composition, but I like to imagine that I'm taking a black and white photograph of it, and I'd like to try to sort of visualize where those values are, what would be darker than something else, or lighter than something else. Because every color that we see has a value to it. And this is one of the hardest things to figure out in painting, is sort of how to match the exact value of color that you're seeing. So I recommend working from back to front. So I may want to sort of, I have like a pretty dark background behind here. So I'm going to add a bit of white to my black, but not a ton. And if, let's say, like one of my colors gets a little bit more blue than I might need, maybe just experiment with it. I really like playing with sort of the temperature of my grays. So you can add a little bit of blue or a little bit of magenta, depending on how warm or cool you want it to be. But then again, you do want, if you want to glaze over, if I wanted to glaze over this apple, I would not want it to be a really green or blue underpainting. I might want to even push a little bit more magenta into my underpainting or my grayscale, so that it's a lot easier to sort of have a harmony of color when I put that red on top. Does that make sense? Yeah, so the next thing I would do is sort of go through with this tone and just paint in the thing that's furthest away. And don't worry about it being perfect. Because I'll be painting over this, I can even like take this right over the edge of the things that I've got going on over here, and it's not a big deal. And just don't stress. I know that like your first painting, you might feel like, this has to be my magnum opus, but it does not need to be. Every single painting we make in here, especially this first 4 weeks where we'll be really just focusing on the basics, is really just gonna be about trying it. And we're gonna make mistakes. Every single person, including me, will make mistakes. And as we go, sort of solving the problems is gonna be a really great way of learning how to use your paint. Do you have any questions?
I'm just concerned, how, is that a big difference if we use pencil instead of the pre-paint, like as a pre-drawing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'll challenge you to try this today, just because this is a really traditional way of working, and it's a challenge. So you'll learn something new through the process. Next week, I'll show you how you can actually create a drawing that's the same size as your canvas and then transfer it over. So there's multiple ways to sort of get your drawing on your canvas. And if you need to sneak in a little bit of graphite, it's okay, but at least try to sort of be loose with your drawing, because it'll sort of help you to sort of loosen up your process overall.
Also, I have another question about the colors. I mean, it seemed easier to me to use the lighter colors first and then go to the darker colors. But I'm not sure. Would it make it
Yeah, so there's so many ways of approaching a painting. I know that a lot of people sort of have the rule of thumb that when you're working with watercolor or gouache, you start with the lightest, but when you're working with acrylic, you start with the darkest. So I might sort of try working from back to front, no matter what that texture is. But you know, for instance, I might, before I paint in this apple, I might find it helpful to first paint in the shadow beneath it. And this can be helpful because when I go to paint in the actual object, it will sit physically on top of the shadow, which is kind of like how shadows live within spaces. They like hide in nooks and crannies. So you can sort of make it so that your brush strokes are physically going on top of the shadow, and it can be really helpful. So it sounds like you've maybe done a lot of painting with watercolor.
I did paint
Yeah.
with watercolor, and I also did with acrylic. But I think you're right. Maybe the darkest should go first because you can bait over it. It's not like the watercolor. I think maybe that was my mistake.
Yeah. But I'm really excited to see your watercolor work.
It's not normal.
Awesome. Any other questions? Okay, cool. So go for it. Have fun. Don't be afraid. You're going to do amazing. I'm so excited to see what happens.
I did actually. I was curious so about the angle or the point of view, right?
Yes.
Like it's not on the same plane that we're looking at, but that's okay because that's where the shadows and whatnot are.
Yeah, so really sort of, if you want to sort of stand where I was and sort of get a sense of sort of how I was looking at it from there to capture this shadow.
Yeah.
So wherever you choose to sort of stand, I would make that like your zone.
Yep.
Sort of hone in on, and that's why sort of getting the drawing all in one sitting is really helpful.
Yeah.
So that you know sort of.
You don't have to try to recapture that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.